Lacey did multiple testing. And then
Mm-hmm.
when she did get pregnant, we also had Ava Race tested while she was in the womb. So
Okay.
they did all the preliminary blood work before she came out.
How is it possible an organ donor might actually be responsible for two lives, even when giving a heart to a man? What was life like for Nick May years after his heart transplant? Did Nick May have a similar experience as his siblings growing up, considering he had a heart transplant as an infant? Welcome to Heart with Anna. I am Anna Jaworski and the mother of a daughter with a critical congenital heart defect. She's had 3 open heart surgeries and is my inspiration and the reason I'm the host of your program. Today's show is The Gift of Life, twice, and our guests are Susan and Nick May. Susan May is mom to Nick, 33, who was born with hypoplastic left heart syndrome, transposition of the great arteries, coarctation of the aorta, and a septal defect. He had 3 surgeries at 5 days, 3.5 months, and 1 year of age prior to receiving a heart transplant just before his 2nd birthday. Nick is one of the first children in the United States to receive a heart transplant and is the 5th longest living heart transplant recipient. Today, he is married with a daughter. Susan has written a book about her son's heart journey with a revised edition released this year. Susan also writes professionally and has written 40 books in total, including a nonfiction book about a World War II flight surgeon and 33 medical romance novels. She has 3 other children and 8 grandchildren. She likes to travel, read, and sew. My loyal listeners will remember Susan from earlier in 2022 when she came on the program with an episode called Baby Heart Transplant Miracle. Welcome back to Heart with Anna, Susan.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the show.
Me too, Susan. And welcome to Heart with Anna, Nick.
Thanks for having me. I look forward to it.
Me too, because I've had a chance to talk to your mom now, and it's really exciting to me that I get a chance to get to know you a little bit better, Nick. In fact, we'll be talking to your mom, Susan, in the 2nd segment, and we'll start this show with you, Nick. We know that you received a heart transplant as an infant. Your mom talked to us about your early life when she was on the program before. Now I'd like to talk to you about growing up with a transplanted heart. When did you first realize that you had a heart transplant?
I realized that I had a heart transplant around 6 or 7 years old, 3rd grade, 4th grade-ish, knowing that I didn't have as much activity level as the younger kids my age, like running around on a play set, getting tired quicker than they did, not being able to keep up with day-to-day activities like kids that were around my age at the time.
Even though your transplanted heart didn't have any defects, you still weren't quite able to keep up with the other kids?
Yes, ma'am, because I have no nerve endings, so it takes me longer to kind of get warmed up, as you would say, and be active.
Really? I didn't know that. So it took you a little bit longer to get warmed up, but once you got warmed up and you were moving, were you able to keep up with the kids then?
Yes, ma'am, but I'd still have to stop and take breaks
Mm-hmm.
because my energy level was not the same as theirs, even though I was considered warmed up and ready to go. I would still get tired quicker. My stamina was not the same as theirs.
Right. Did you also have more illnesses than your peers?
Yes, ma'am, I
Mm-hmm.
was constantly sick with either strep throat. Usually got that twice a year. And now into my adult life, it's lingered into pneumonia.
Oh, no.
Yes, ma'am.
Wow. So you're dealing with pneumonia once or twice a year?
Yes, ma'am.
Wow, that's a lot to deal with. And that's partly because you're still on those anti-rejection drugs, so that depresses your immune system, right?
Correct.
Yeah. And your lungs are more at risk because you've been on a ventilator multiple days of your life.
Correct.
Wow. Okay. And I understand you had some trouble in college and that you even had to withdraw during your first year because of your heart. Can you tell me a little bit about that time in your life?
Yes, ma'am. I was a sophomore in college, so '09. I was at Georgia Highlands College that is in town. Was in writing class, and luckily I had a good friend who went to high school with me in the same class. And I leaned over to him and said, "Hey, man, I don't feel too good." And coincidentally, I accidentally forgot to take my medication that morning. I had to come home anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I was sleeping 12 hours a day, wake up, eat, sleep, go to school, and then basically repeat the same process. But for that one day, I told him, "Hey, I'm not feeling well. I'm going to go home. I'm not sure when I'm going to come back."
Oh,
So
wow.
he was nervous. He said, "Just
Mm-hmm.
keep me in the loop."
Mm-hmm.
But come to find out, had endocarditis, which
Oh,
well, a major infection on the
right.
heart from the images that they showed. It looked like the sun was resting on my heart because all the infection. So where the sun was sitting on my heart, it was basically infection, basically pulsating out towards the whole body with the
Oh,
endocarditis.
wow.
And so I had a aorta transplant to replace the whole aorta. And then, knock on wood, nothing major since.
Wow. Okay. So you had endocarditis and they didn't feel you needed an entire transplant, but they felt they needed to cut out the aorta and transplant a new aorta just to get rid of the endocarditis?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh my goodness. That must have been terrifying for you.
Luckily, I was somewhat young enough to know it was naive or just too sick to, I don't want to say don't care, but
You
I
just
was,
wanted to feel well again.
you're right.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
because I would just sleep and eat. So
Yeah.
I didn't know anything else than that for 2 or 3 months.
Mm.
And I'd go to the primary in town, but they couldn't find nothing until they
Right.
finally did a full CT scan and found it.
Home Tonight Forever by the Baby Blue Sound Collective.
I think what I love so much about this CD is that some of the songs were inspired by the patients.
Many listeners will understand many of the different songs and what they've been inspired by. Our new album will be available on iTunes, Amazon.com, Spotify.
I love the fact that the proceeds from this CD are actually going to help those with congenital heart defects.
Enjoy the music.
Home Tonight Forever.
This content is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The opinions expressed in the podcast are not those of Hearts Unite the Globe, but of the hosts and guests, and are intended to spark discussion about issues pertaining to congenital heart disease or bereavement.
You are listening to Heart with Anna. If you have a question or comment that you would like addressed on our show, please send an email to Anna Jaworski at anna@hearttoheartwithanna.com. That's anna@hearttoheartwithanna.com. Now, back to Heart with Anna.
I've never heard of just getting an aorta transplant. That's amazing.
It's rare, but they did have one other girl at Eggleston. Dr. Tanner did a paper on it, but he has a full aorta on top of having a heart transplant. His aorta looked like a golf ball size of just shooting pus. It was all,
That's
yeah, it was
just awful. Your aorta is so important. I mean, it takes the blood from the heart and puts it out to the entire body. So you don't want that to be full of pus.
No, and he had a PICC line for, what was it, Nick? Probably 10 weeks altogether.
Wow.
10, 12 weeks.
Yeah, I think it was 3 months of antibiotics.
Yeah, he had
Oh, wow.
2 in the hospital, and they had to wait till after the surgery, and they thought he'd gotten the new aorta and gave him a whole nother clean one to come home with. Yeah, yeah. It made the heart transplant look like a piece of cake.
Isn't that amazing, Susan?
Yeah.
So they tried using a PICC line, which for those of you who are listening who don't know what that means, it's PICC, P-I-C-C. It's a special kind of catheter that they put inside of you to make it easier so they don't have to poke you over and over and over again to give you medication. And the medication goes exactly where it needs to go instead of trying to swallow a pill and taking time for it to react the way that you need it to. And so it's more convenient to have a PICC line when you have somebody who needs antibiotics in their body instead of through a pill. But who wants to walk around with a catheter stuck? And they usually do it in the neck, right?
Yeah, it's done in the neck, and it dripped straight into his heart.
Yeah, so it's not comfortable to have this PICC line. So to have that for 3 months. So it sounds like they inserted the PICC line. They started giving him some powerful antibiotics to try and clear up the endocarditis. But then they discovered, look, we just can't get rid of this fast enough. Is that what it was?
Well, actually, the PICC line came after they discovered the endocarditis. And they did do that with the CT scan, but they were looking for cancer. They told us that he had cancer, which is a side effect of immunosuppressants.
Right.
And so they were trying to see exactly where the cancer, I mean, literally, the 2 doctors came in and told me, standing by myself, that he had cancer.
Oh, Susan.
On
I'm
a Friday,
so sorry.
on a Friday afternoon, no less.
Right.
But they had to do some more tests. And then they did do the additional test. And I think they were really surprised to find what they saw. And then he had to wait a few days till he got a PICC line, kind of had to wait about a week till they could get the infection under control. Because by this time, the infection was in his liver, his kidneys, his stomach, everything.
Oh, wow.
Because all of that blood was running past through that aorta.
Sure.
And so he was pumping infection all over his body.
Oh, my goodness.
They did the surgery, and then he had to have the additional PICC line. But it's the first time in his life he could remember chest tubes and having his chest open. And that's because he had been so small when all of that had happened before. So it was a different effect with his brothers and sisters who did not remember that either. And so the dynamics had changed completely by the time he was 19.
Sure.
So,
well, they were all adults.
Yeah.
All of them were adults. It's very different when they're adults. I know my child had surgery at 17, and Joey, my older child, was 3 years older. He was out on his own, and it was a very different experience for him.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And it's always, I mean, Nick's always been who Nick is. And the kids have always seen him that way. So they don't think anything about it. And as my daughter says, they take their cues from how their mom and dad act.
Right.
And we've always been pretty positive about things. So it was a difficult time for everybody.
Of course it was. Let's back up a little bit. When Nick was young, we know he's the youngest of the 4 children. So the other children have always known that Nick has a special heart. Were you able to raise him so that he had the same experiences as his older siblings? Or did you always feel that you had to be a little bit more protective of Nick?
we were not more protective. My husband and my view was that we wanted Nick to live the best life he could, and that didn't mean us always keeping him in a bubble and looking over his shoulder. Now, we didn't tell him to go and jump off cliffs and things like that, but
you wouldn't with your other children either, right?
no, that's correct. That's true. But Nick was expected to behave and have good manners, and he had chores. He was probably the sorriest of the bunch about chores, but he had them. And he learned to water ski when the others did. And he was a little later riding a bicycle, but we moved to a house on the hill about the time he was supposed to learn to ride a bicycle. And so that wasn't very appealing. So he was a little later, but when we had a flat surface, he did learn to ride and ride horses and snow ski. And he did everything any of the other kids did, except he wanted to play football, and he wasn't able to do that. But but he compensated in other ways for that. So I wish that I could say that it was more dramatic than that, but we were very purposeful about making sure he lived as much like the regular old Joe as possible. And we wanted him to be liked. And I think the fear of being a helicopter mom and dad would have made him be unliked.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, that totally makes sense. That absolutely makes sense. Okay. Can you tell me about when Nick actually left the nest? Because I know that's a big deal for any parent, is having their kids leave home, and what he does now professionally.
He left home when he wasn't finished with college, but he got married, and he has an excellent wife that takes superb care of him and calls his mama when she's not happy with him about his medical care anyway, still to this day. And I was happy and glad. And by the time he moved out and got married, he was prepared, or I did all I could to prepare him to take care of himself. And he had been taking care of a lot of stuff prior to that because he was 26. But his wife was prepared as well. I spent a lot of time talking to her about it. Even before they got married, she would go with us to his doctor's appointments.
Really?
So, yeah.
That's wonderful. Her eyes were wide open going into this.
She's very proactive about taking care of him and doing what he would need. And I was quite frank about what life may look like for her and him, and that they need to be prepared for that. So, yeah, she was really great. She is better than, say, my other in-laws. She grasps the seriousness of it, actually, but almost nobody gets it to the same extent as Nick's parents do.
Well, sure, because you've seen him as an infant going through everything.
Right. But she's sensitive to it and is very proactive about him doing what he needs to do. So I was happy. And that's the way God made things was you're supposed to let them go.
Absolutely.
And so that was the goal. And we achieved that goal.
Absolutely.
How was I going to have grandchildren if I didn't, you know?
Well, let's talk about that because you are a grandmother, thanks to Nick's wife, Lacey. And in a way, that means that his donor gave the gift of life twice. Because first in saving Nick's life, and then secondly, by enabling him to be married and to become a dad. So talk to me about how that made you feel, Susan.
Well, it was a big deal. It really was. And I'm tickled. And Ava Grace is, I mean, she's better than a piece of candy. She really is.
Love that.
And she's the sweetie. Nick and Lacey are great parents. And we get to see her regularly. They don't live terribly far from us, but she started school this year, so we don't see her quite as much as we did because of that. But there's nothing like seeing your grandkid run to you with their arms open wide. It is nice. It is, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. I'm glad for Nick and Lacey both. to have such a sweetheart for a child.
And of course, the question that's running through everyone's mind is, how is Ava Grace's heart?
It's good. It's good. And not only for Nick and Lacey, but also for my other children. That's always come up when they've gotten pregnant. I know 5% of those that have heart problems have children with heart problems. I didn't feel like that was a large enough percentage to discourage Nick from having children. If it had been 50%, that's a different thing. But they've never been able to say what happened and why Nick was born with a bad heart. If there had been something that showed it was hereditary and stuff like that, I might have dissuaded it. But Lacey took care of herself and did what she needed to do. So there wasn't any reason that I suspected that there would be a problem.
Anna Jaworski has written several books to empower the congenital heart defect, or CHD, community. These books can be found at Amazon.com or at her website, www.babyheartspress.com. Her bestseller is The Heart of a Mother, an anthology of stories written by women for women in the CHD community. Anna's other books, My Brother Needs an Operation, The Heart of a Father, and Hypoplastic Left Heart Syndrome, a handbook for parents, will help you understand that you are not alone. Visit babyheartspress.com to find out more.
Heart to Heart with Anna is a presentation of Hearts Unite the Globe and is part of the Hug Podcast Network. Hearts Unite the Globe is a non-profit organization devoted to providing resources to the congenital heart defect community to uplift, empower, and enrich the lives of our community members. If you would like access to free resources pertaining to the CHD community, please visit our website at www.congenitalheartdefects.com for information about CHD, the hospitals that treat children with CHD, summer camps for CHD survivors, and much, much more.
Now, mother and son are in the studio together with me. Nick, I'd like for you to answer this first question. Can you tell me what it was like for you when you were dating and considering getting married, especially now that we know you were living at home for that period of time? Did you have any special concerns because of your heart regarding developing a long-term relationship?
No, ma'am, I did not. I just wanted to be upfront with whomever and lucky gal was going to be. But luckily, Lacey and I both went to high school together.
Oh, okay.
So she knew of me and knew of, hey, he was the kid with the heart transplant. So she knew bits and pieces. But till we started to date, that's when she got pretty much the full treatment of this is where I was, this is where I am now, and this is where it can go.
Yeah.
I was upfront with her about the whole heart situation, so there was no secrets whatsoever.
I think that's the smart way to be. You just be upfront with everybody. There's no need to hide it, especially something that big. It can't stay hidden for very long, I wouldn't imagine.
Right. There was also a comfort level for myself. I can't speak for my mother, but at least going to school and knowing Lacey previously and also knowing her mother previously, they weren't caught off guard.
Right. So you knew that your future wife also had the support of her family in regard to this.
Correct.
That's wonderful. That's great. Susan, in the previous show that you were on with me, we talked about Nick getting married and whether or not you were concerned your grandchild would have a heart defect. And I'll put the link to that show in the show notes. But today I'd like to know if you had any special concerns regarding Nick when you found out that Lacey was expecting. As you know, it takes a lot of energy to be a parent, right? Were you ever concerned about Nick's health or what parenthood might mean for him given his condition?
I was more concerned about the baby than I was Nick. I wasn't worried about his health condition as far as the baby was concerned or anything like that. I just wanted him to be a good father. And he's been a good father from that relationship. And longevity has always been a concern. And after you have a child, you want to live a long time. But none of us are guaranteed another day or another hour.
Right.
And whether we have a heart transplant or not.
Right.
So I try to remind him of that and to live every day to the best you can and make the most of it. But Ava Grace will deal with her daddy's health just the same way I'm sure that we dealt with his health. It's a part of everyday life. And she now can say, well, Daddy has to go to the hospital. And it's that slow learning curve that we all have. And you can't pile everything on at one time.
Right.
But to be honest, that part never did occur, even crossed my mind that Nick wouldn't be healthy enough to be having a child or anything like that. Now, if he had been the female in the situation, I would have been more concerned, obviously.
Right.
But we make the most of every day and appreciate every day. And that's how we've always dealt, and that's how we'll continue to do it.
So it sounds like he and Lacey live nearby. Do you and your husband help out with childcare with Ava Grace?
Well, not now since she's in school, but if Nick needs to go to the hospital or go for checkups or things like that, Ava Grace gets to come stay with us. So as far as we're concerned, Nick doesn't go to the hospital often enough. But
I do know. I'm an Oma, so I totally get it. You want to spend as much time with that grandbaby as you possibly can.
yeah, so you just go with that. But now I will say this is since Ava Grace has started school, Lacey is a room mother, and Nick has a hospital appointment closer to Christmas or closer to the end of school for Christmas holidays, and he's gotten thrown down for the Christmas party. So I'm getting to go to the hospital with Nick, and I haven't gotten up at 5 or 6 in the morning to make that little journey in probably 8 years.
Oh my goodness.
So I'm the partner this time because when he goes for a heart cath, they put him to sleep. He can't drive himself home. And I'm a firm believer that everybody should have a second person listening when they go for big appointments.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
Yeah. And not enough do that, but I don't like for him to go for his appointments like that without somebody else to listen.
Well, Nick, let's talk a little bit about Ava Grace. Were you worried when you found out Lacey was pregnant that Ava Grace would have a heart defect?
No, ma'am, because Lacey did multiple testing. And then when she did get pregnant, we also had Ava Grace tested while she was in the womb.
Okay.
So they did all the preliminary blood work before she came out.
So was Lacey seeing a high-risk OBGYN?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. It's nice that you were able to get all of that extra testing and that you knew before she was born that she was heart healthy.
Yeah. It was a big relief for both Lacey and I.
Is Ava Grace going to have a brother or sister someday?
Oh, no.
She'll be an only child.
One and done.
One and done. Okay, that means she gets, I was just going to say, that means she gets spoiled even more. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Susan, you talked to us the last time you were on the show about this book that you had written. Can you tell my listeners a little bit more about the book and where they can buy it?
It's called Nick's New Heart, 30 Years and Counting. It's a second edition, but with a whole lot of addition to it. I wrote it for Nick's 30th anniversary, and it came out on his 30th anniversary of his transplanted heart. And it is available at Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Kobo, iBooks, anything you can think of, it is available on there. And even if you've read the first version of it, the second version is significantly different. I even interviewed Nick's brothers and sisters, the in-laws, and Nick's doctors before and after about what they thought at different times, like about that aorta business. And so
yeah,
it's
he's had significant things happen even after the transplant.
oh yes, most definitely. The first version went up to Nick was 18, and the second version went to Nick was 31. So there was a whole lot of life after 18.
Yeah. For one thing, he and Lacey got married.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
That's a huge chapter, I'm sure.
Yeah.
It has been so much fun to catch up with you, Susan. And Nick, it was so delightful to meet you after having learned so much about you from your mom. Thank you so much for coming on the program today.
All right. Thanks for having me.
And Susan, thanks for coming back on this show and sharing your son with me. Wasn't this fun to do a program with your son?
It was. And thank you for having us. We like to share their story.
It's a wonderful story to share, and I'm sure it's so inspirational for a mother looking at her infant needing a heart transplant. That's such a scary prospect. And to think that he could live to be old enough to get married, to start his own family, that is so inspirational.
I like to think so. I'm proud of him.
Absolutely. I can see why. And just to clarify, you were very concerned when he had that endocarditis episode that he also had cancer, but that was not the case. It was just endocarditis. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's
I just
correct.
want to make sure that's clear to everybody. He's still
Yeah.
cancer-free because we do know
Yes.
that cancer can be a concern when it
Yeah.
comes to immunosuppressant drugs. And it seems like he is still doing fine in that arena.
Correct. Yes.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, friends, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Heart to Heart with Anna. That does conclude our program today. Thanks for listening. Please visit us at heartsunitetheglobe.org and you can learn so much. We have all kinds of free resources at our website. Hearts Unite the Globe is a nonprofit organization that pays for us to have this podcast. Thanks for listening. And remember, my friends, you are not alone.
Thank you again for joining us this week. We hope you have become inspired and empowered to become an advocate for the congenital heart community. Heart to Heart with Anna with your host, Anna Jaworski, can be heard at any time wherever you get your podcasts. A new episode is released every Tuesday from noon Eastern Time.